Hello, and welcome then to Chapter 2, Writing the History of the First World War. I'm still looking at sources, the sort of places that historians might look for documents and the importance of the difference between them, the strong points and the weak points of each kind of primary source that you might use. And I spoke to you last just a moment ago about letters, and here's another kind of document, and you can see here on the title page, The Reluctant Tommy, Ronald Skirth's extraordinary memoir of the First World War. Now, strictly speaking, this is not a memoir, this particular book, because it was written at the time. We make a difference between diaries, which are written at the time, a little bit every day perhaps, and memoirs, which are written later. And these are very different kinds of source, because later on, your memory might not be so good. You might have changed your attitude to the war or to your experience, or you might see things through a different filter. So here we have an example, in fact, of a diary. And this one is a particularly interesting diary, because diaries often have the same difficulty that letters have, that there are far more written by elite sections of the population who are more used to thinking that their experience should be valued and written down, and rather fewer by subaltern sections of the population. Again, this is the situation is somewhat better than it used to be, because there are now quite a large number of diaries which have been found, which belonged to very ordinary people. But this one is a particularly interesting one, because quite naturally, people who were proud of what they did in the war and found that there was something glorious about it would be much more likely to want to publish their diary than other people. So this piece was published by, I think, his great-grandson or something, and it's rather particular in that it's a diary of a soldier who went to war but didn't want to, who was against the war, who was not an anti-war activist. Very few of those, although in 1916 the anti-war movement became quite strong for a short period of time. But the reluctant Tommy, and he shows very much a mistrust in connection with the military aims of his government. So that's one example. And here's another one, the Home Fires Diary. Again, this is a diary. Now, this one is correctly marked on the front pages as a diary, the Great War Diaries of Georgina Lee. A fascinating book, published quite recently, though, like I say, written at the time. And this is the diary of an elite woman, a bourgeois woman, who stayed at home with her child while her husband was an officer out fighting. And she was an enthusiastic supporter of the war. She went to see one of the great preachers in favor of the war, who used to like to say, this is a conflict between the nailed hand and the armed fist. You know, the nailed hand of Jesus and the armed fist of Germany. You know, poetic propaganda. And what she actually did is, at the time, she wrote letters to her baby. She had a very small baby, and every day she wrote a letter to her baby, hoping that eventually the collection of letters would educate the child about his father's life and the importance of the war. So absolutely fascinating documents here, and these are the four sources of diaries written at the time, which of course have the advantage of being full of detail, detail that brings to life the events of the time, and that expresses the feelings that the different people had, could be very varied. And of course the disadvantage in that they can be quite enclosed within their own subjectivity, and so tell you little about what other people were feeling at the time. Our next source. These are correctly termed memoirs, and that these are documents which were written later, biographical documents written later. And I have a couple of examples here. Here we have Old Soldiers Never Die by Private Frank Richards. And this is a rather particular memoir, because it's not written by somebody who joined enthusiastically the army in 1914, not at all. This is written by a professional soldier who was already in the army before the war. In fact, the British Army in the First World War was made up of three groups of people. First of all, the not very big old army, people who were professional soldiers, because Britain, unlike many uh, countries involved in the war, and in particular, unlike France, did not have military service before the First World War. Whereas in France, you automatically had, I think it was 2 years military service. And this, of course, transformed the attitudes of the ordinary people when they suddenly found themselves in the army. So interesting group of people, the old soldiers. They didn't have a good time. They began rather poorly prepared and were rushed off to France, and an enormous number of men were killed. And this was particularly a pity from a military point of view for the people who wanted Britain to win the war, because the only soldiers who actually trained as soldiers were very much killed off, and so they were very short of people to train the new armies, because, as I was saying, the British Army was made up of three groups during the First World War. First of all, the professional soldiers. Secondly, the volunteers who said in 1914, 1915, I want to join. I'm sure the war won't be very long. It sounds kind of fun. I've never traveled, or whatever they said to themselves, or, long live the empire. And that's the second group, the Kitchener's armies, the new armies set up in 1914, and they were organized separately. And they had rather special contracts. You joined for the duration. So you didn't join for 3 years or for 6 years. You joined until the war is ended, which many people thought was not going to be very long. And the third group, because after a couple of years, they weren't getting enough volunteers. And in particular, once the lists of wounded and dead started coming in and being published partly in the newspapers or from word of mouth around the towns and villages, the number of people wanting to volunteer went down very, very considerably. And it was no longer possible to get enough people to volunteer. And in 1916, the British government decided to introduce conscription. That is, that the rest of the men were obliged to join the army. And indeed, contrary to popular belief, the majority of British soldiers who fought in the First World War were obliged to do so by law. It's only a slight majority, 52% or something like that, but the majority were actually conscripts. So the first memoir there of an old soldier, an old professional soldier. Another memoir which caused a big scandal when it was published at the very end of the 1920s, I think. Robert Graves. Robert Graves is a poet, and he wrote this Goodbye to All That, a memoir of his time in the First World War, and he was extremely negative about his time in the First World War, and he emphasized the cruelty of officers, and indeed alleged that officers would threaten to shoot men who refused to advance. And he was very much attacked for this, but this became quite an influential and very well written, because of course he was a poet, quite an influential document when it came out at the end of the 20s. It may have been the very beginning of the 30s, I'm not quite sure. So these sources then are memoirs written later, soldiers' memoirs written later, important sources. But again, every time you look at a source, you need to look at the grammar of a source. That is, that what is the standpoint of the person writing, not just from the point of view of what is their opinion, but also what is their experience. We notice, for example, that memoirs about the First World War written before 1939 can sometimes be considerably different from memoirs of the First World War written after 1945. Because before 1939, many people thought of the First World War as the Great War, which was absolutely terrible, but it was only once. And after the Second World War, people's view of the First World War changed. And this is a very unsurprising, for the historian, unsurprising result of how memory works, that it is altered by our subsequent experiences. I have many more sources to look at. What about this one? Politicians and generals' memoirs. If we talked just a moment ago about soldiers' memoirs, but politicians and generals also like to publish memoirs, and they have an objective. And I think, in general, we always have to keep in mind what the source's objective of is, and quite understandably, the objective is tends to be to show that they were generally right. And that they made a positive contribution to history. Now, sophisticated generals or politicians will not claim to have been always right. That's not realistic. People won't believe you, but they will claim to have essentially been on the right side of history. And here we have an example of David Lloyd George, and you can see the War Memoirs of David Lloyd George, volume 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Yeah, he had a lot to say. And quite a fascinating book for the Second World War. Winston Churchill will write his memoirs, which will be very successful because also he's an extremely good writer. Now, Lloyd George, if you don't remember much about Lloyd George, he had a number of different lives. He was a Welsh orator and Prime Minister, of course. And before the First World War, he was he had ministerial posts of other sorts, and he's remained famous for two things. First of all, that he was one of the politicians who set up some of the first welfare state measures in 1906 and 1909. I can't remember all of them. I think there's some free school meals, old age pensions, some of these things which we associate with the welfare state, and mostly we associate the welfare state with 1945 and afterwards, but there were the beginnings. These were not the first social measures in the world. Germany did many of did some of this kind of welfare state measure earlier. And indeed Prussia, but that's the first thing that Lloyd George has remembered about these social reforms at the beginning of the 20th century. And second thing he's remembered at is but for taking over the leadership of the government in the middle of the First World War, and therefore helping to bring it to a successful conclusion from the point of view of the British establishment. Here we have an example from France, the memoirs of Maréchal Foch, and then you have the subtitle, Pour servir à l'histoire de la guerre. Okay, so yeah, he's writing to make sure that history sees his point of view. Yeah, so politicians and generals' memoirs are sources that we would expect to use at the same time as measuring them with respect to the viewpoint and experience of the people who wrote them. More memoirs, and I think I already mentioned, oh no, I didn't mention this one, I mentioned it in another class with another group. Another kind of memoir, activists' memoirs. And activist memoirs have very much the same objective as generals and politicians' memoirs. They are an attempt to remind the public that they were right, that they were fundamentally right, were fundamentally on the right side of history. And particularly, they like to write for the social movements of the future, who need to learn about social movements of the past. Now, the home front, well, Sylvia Pankhurst was one of the daughters of Emmeline Pankhurst, the great suffragette, and the suffragette movement, which had been very radical indeed before the First World War, with hunger strikes and burning a few houses down, and burning letterboxes was one of their tactics. A very radical movement was very much divided when the First World War arrived, because the most of the suffragettes supported the war, and indeed the main suffragette newspaper changed its name from The Suffragette to Britannia. And Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother of the Pankhurst family, campaigned for conscription, for men to be obliged to go to war. She had a few daughters, and Christabel was on her side and was in favor of the war. whereas Sylvia, and also to a lesser extent another daughter who lived in Australia, were on the other side completely. So Sylvia Pankhurst was completely opposed to the war, but she was an activist, and she spent the war in the poor parts of London trying to organise to defend the situation of poor women, in particular establishing a toy factory so that women could make some money to help their families along. And also she helped she tried to help conscientious objectors and so on. So she wrote a book about this, The Home Front, which I highly recommend, about her experience. And William Gallagher, similarly, an anti-war campaigner. And this book actually does not just talk about the war; it talks about before the war and during the war. During the war, in most towns in Britain, the anti-war movement was rather small and risked being attacked by pro-war elements if they had a meeting. But there are exceptions to this. First of all, in Scotland, in Glasgow, where there was a very strong left-wing presence, the war was less popular, and there was a significant anti-war movement, and William Gallagher was part of this. The other exception would be Ireland, where the Irish nationalists, those who wanted independence for Ireland, were completely divided, with one section of them saying, hey, if we fight for the empire, surely England will be more generous with us after the war and give us more autonomy, perhaps even independence. And another section of the Irish nationalists who said, no, that's complete, that's the wrong way to look at things. The British Army is in France. Now is the time to organise an armed uprising and take our independence, and not hope that the British Empire will give it to us. And the second group was at the base of the Easter Rising in 1916, where a few hundred armed Irish nationalists took over the centre of Dublin, and who were defeated very much by the British Army, and all their leaders were immediately executed to later become Irish national heroes. So activist memoirs are a place that we might look for a particular view of what was going on, and obviously an unofficial view, a view by people who didn't agree. Contemporary newspapers, this takes me back to what I was quoting from Lyndon Strachey. One of the difficulties we have with the First World War is the number of sources involved. And so the contemporary newspapers, of course, they came out every day. This is a typical front page of the Times. At the time, you can see that they, I think that they had only just got the technology to put photographs in the newspapers, and that this was quite expensive. Actually, so quite often you got front pages like that, absolutely full of text, as the Times. The Herald is an interesting newspaper because it was a newspaper which was published throughout the war, which was against the war. And so, and you see the headline there: "You workers must end the war, or war will end you." Now, sometimes the Herald had to be brought out with only one page, because there was a shortage of paper during the war. But interestingly enough, it was not closed down by the government. The government considered that it was safe to allow the Herald to continue publishing. And the gentleman who published it, whose name has escaped my mind for the moment, had a very intelligent view of politics, because although he was completely against the war, he was willing to have writing in his newspaper people who were not completely against the war, but who were criticizing one or other aspect of the government's policy. And so there's still a lot of work to be done on the Herald. There's definitely research work to be done on it, because a lot of it's been forgotten. Contemporary newspapers. The Illustrated Sunday Herald was one of the very popular newspaper at the time. It was more lots of pictures in it. Just an example. And here, a final example. Here you can see a photograph in the newspaper. You could have them, and this particular photograph shows the exhibiting of a German gun in Liverpool, that they captured the gun and they took it around the country to show people the victory and to encourage them, to join the army or to give money for such and such a cause connected with the war, because, as I'll probably mention again, charities were extremely important during the war, because there was little expectation that the government would help people who had problems, and a lot of expectation that charity would do the trick. Some of these charitable attempts would appear to be rather strange to us today. For example, there was an enormous campaign for let's send 1 million cigarettes to our boys in the trenches. Very, very popular campaign, because the worries about the health effects of cigarettes were far in the future. So contemporary newspapers now, that gives you an enormous amount of source material, and so obviously anybody who was writing a history based on the contemporary newspapers would need to be very attentive to the grammar of the source, how it is structured, who owns it, who writes for it, what controls what they write, how free are they to write, how do they see their job, and so on, all these things which will mold the resulting source. Photographs of army life are obviously an important source. They have an advantage as well, in that quite often a photograph will tell you something which it wasn't necessarily intending to tell you. That is, you can look at photographs which were taken for one reason, and there may be information in it which was not put there deliberately. This is something which in historiography we call reading documents against the grain. That is not just taking from the document what the person who created the document wanted to put in, but looking for other things. Now here we have, what is this? Yes, this is 2 or 3 soldiers showing a poster that they had been honoured by the king. They'd been honoured by the king, and this is of wounded soldiers and a nurse. So these photographs, if you can get a collection and you know why they were taken, more or less, you could obviously collect a lot of information. For example, perhaps about how photographers of the time liked to present wounded soldiers, because obviously how you present wounded soldiers as heroes or as victims and so on is part of the historical material. Although photographs of army life obviously if they're important, that also it can be important is photographs of civilian life. Now, civilian life is often referred to by some historians of the First World War as the home front. But this is a very interesting, le front intérieur in French, and this is a very interesting expression because it suggests that in this First World War, which is a total war, everything which civilians do is motivated by an effort to try to win the war. But as historians looked more at civilian life during the war, they realized this wasn't really an accurate way of looking at the world. Civilians often had quite different priorities. Only a very small number of them were absolutely against the war, but certainly many of them had as their main objective to survive and for their families to survive rather than for the war to win. Here you can see women working in arms factories, but this shows both then the changes in women's situation, which the authorities were obliged to bring in if they wanted to win the war, but it also shows something else. For example, wages went up considerably during the war. Indeed, if you were not called into the army in the working class, you were probably better off in 1918 than you were in 1914 because the wages were considerably higher. Some of the newspapers used to mock this situation. They used to say, oh, yes, all these workers, they're buying pianos now. This was if you like, a bit of a caricature, not completely untrue, and said, oh, you know, that the workers have worked, have got wages which are now so high that they can buy pianos. There you have women there. Fascinating photograph here. I think perhaps you can guess who these women are, and if you can't guess who they are, then you just have to count them. There are 11 of them. This is a football team. And this is a symbol of one of the enormous changes that happened during the First World War, because in 1917, there was more women's football in Britain than in 2017. What had happened was that although there may have been enough young men to play football, it was politically impossible very shortly after the beginning of the war to have a team of young men playing football for a crowd of supporters, because in this crowd of supporters there would be many people saying, why aren't they in the army? They're young, they're healthy, we need them in the army, they shouldn't be playing football. So very quickly the football got closed down, even if they might have had enough men to do it. And women's football, because a lot of women who loved football and had little chance to do it beforehand, women's football actually rose, and by the end of the war you had women's football games where you had tens of thousands of people watching. In particular, the young women were sometimes moved across the country to work in the arms factories and lodged in big camps near them, and so you would have a women's football team for each factory. And I think this is a very useful corrective to a very foolish prejudice that we often have about, you know, before the 1960s, women were just passive and just accepted their position. Whereas in fact, this, of course, like in every period, there were many, many exceptions. Here we have women again, women on a bus, on a tram, women conductors on a tram. They were not always well accepted. There had never been women conductors before on the trams. It was a man's job, but they were not always well accepted. Occasionally they would get people who will refuse to pay to a woman, a tram conductor. I remember reading a memoir about a woman whose father was butcher, and at the time the butcher would deliver meat every day into the middle class parts of town, because nobody had a fridge, of course, and so every day the meat was delivered. And because her father went away to war, she took over the van, or horse and cart, or whatever, and delivered the meat. And she had customers, both men and women, who refused to buy meat from her because she was a woman. These attitudes did change during the war, quite slowly, but they did change during the war. And it may well be that the decision in 1918 to allow the vote to women over 30 was connected to some traditional politicians within the Liberal Party giving up on the idea that this was unwomanly and unnatural. They had seen women do so many unnatural things, in inverted commas, during the war, that they were prepared to accept that perhaps it was okay for them to discuss politics, vote at elections, and even stand at elections. That's my half-an-hour chapter up, and I'm also losing my voice, so I will be continuing shortly. Thank you for listening.